Hello, everybody. This is the Dialogue Out Loud podcast. I am Joe Plicka. This is Ryan Shoemaker. We are the fiction editors for Dialogue, and we are delighted to be here today with Danny Nelson, a writer who has published a story in the summer issue of Dialogue called Narrow is the Gate, reprinted from the anthology The Path and the Gate that came out a few years ago, edited by Andrew Hall and Robert Raleigh. We are so excited to be here. Danny is a fiction writer and poet who examines the Mormon experience from inside and outside the culture. He has published work in Monsters and Mormons, Press Forward, Saints, Fire in the Pasture, and The Path and the Gate. He lives in Salt Lake City with his husband and a moderately intelligent dog. Danny, thank you so much for being here.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I was totally struck by this story when I read it in The Path and the Gate. Ryan and I were lucky enough to have been in that anthology as well. And I remember talking to Ryan about it, saying, "Did you read that story?" And he said, "Oh my gosh, it was amazing." I said, "Yes." And we just had this moment where we just knew we needed to bring it to a wider audience. And so thank you for letting us do that. I will never get tired of reading this story. Before we get into anything too specific, I wanted to give you a chance to maybe give us even a little bit more of your personal and professional background, anything that you might think might be relevant to this discussion and relevant to the origins and kind of the development of this story itself, which for those who haven't read it yet, the tagline is aliens visit the Mormons and they turn out to be even more orthodox than the saints themselves. I know that totally simplifies it, but could we just start there? Could you again, anything about your personal professional background and then leading into the story where it came from?
Sure. It's a challenging question as far as summarizing it all. I've always been sort of a writer. I've always been something that I do at very least as a hobby or even just as a way to pass the time. And when I was a kid, because that was a thing that I did a lot, I was surrounded by people who were like, "Oh, you're going to be a great writer someday. You're gonna kind of like write a lot of really wonderful things." And of course, because I was growing up Mormon, there was often this sort of sense that like the great Mormon novel was kind of coming at some point. And I can remember people like my mom or something like that being like, "Yeah, no, this is something that is within your grasp, something that might be ahead of you." And so as far as kind of like my entrance into like writing, as far as like telling stories and things like that, that really marked a lot of my early experiences with writing, thinking about kind of that grand ambition of writing something big. And when I was young, the things that I read, the things that I kind of enjoyed, especially the things that were kind of religiously oriented, were all speculative. So things like, the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis, or even like Chronicles of Narnia or Wrinkle in Time, those sorts of things. So when I thought about, when I was a young kid thinking about, well, what would I write when I'm going to be amazing and wonderful? A lot of times it was, well, what kind of like allegories can I spin out? What kind of things can I say that's really kind of unique to the culture and the religion that I grew up with, that also kind of brings in these elements that I enjoy personally of science fiction, fantasy, that sort of thing. So that really, that was kind of the entry point for something like this story. Which has been a wonderful thing to kind of have that opportunity to tell a story that's really central to Mormonism and also incorporate some of these more fantastic elements. The sort of the theme that it's chewing on has a couple more specific origins, and we can certainly talk about that as well. But as far as just like the broad sense, that's really kind of where the energy of the piece is coming from.
Okay. And and so thematically, if you had to kind of put, well, no, I'm not even going to ask you that question. That's a cruel question to ask an author, actually, to start reducing your story down to key words. But we'll get there. So, okay, so this is a science fiction, speculative fiction with Mormons kind of at the center of it. Um, the thing, well, two things. One, I was going to say, and we don't necessarily have to talk about this a lot, but I will mention it. To me, the story is a masterclass in compression. Writing science fiction, fantasy, writing speculative fiction is challenging in the short form because it requires you to work so quickly and so concisely to establish the rules and kind of the social political context of this world that the reader's not yet familiar with, right? So, and I haven't taught this in my classes yet, but I think as someone who teaches writing and teaches fiction writing, I think I will absolutely use this at some point as an example of, because my students all want to write, many of them want to write sci-fi, speculative fiction and related things, to kind of show them, okay, this is how you do it. This is how you, like, you don't have to spend 3 or 4 pages talking about the alien ship's journey to the, like, by the end of page 1, the ship is there, the aliens have disembarked, we already know who the prophet is, like, just like in such a concise and kind of beautiful way. You characterize Herbertson, Holyoke, the president. This is all done so effectively and so quickly. So kudos on that. That's an amazing work that you've done. But getting to the thematic parts of the story and kind of the things that I think are going to really provoke and interest a lot of the readers of dialogue, we have this notion um, of I don't know what to call it, certainty, um, orthodoxy. Is that, Ryan? Is that, how else would you kind of talk about that? Like the kind of what you would see as the central question of the story here.
Well, I think what's so, I mean, yeah, Danny, like you're working within like that, the science fiction, the speculative genre. But I think what's so beautiful about the story, like in a way, you kind of subvert that genre, right? We've all seen it, right? Just kind of recently, like Disclosure Day. Like I think we have this idea of these some kind of extraterrestrial, um, you know, um, people coming to Earth, and they seem to be more enlightened, and they're going to help us kind of solve some of our social and cultural issues. But it's so interesting, like the aliens come, and right, they are ultra orthodox, right? They are so focused on their mission that they can't even understand that, the Earthlings might be interested in their science and in their culture, right? They're just fixated on meeting Herbertson and having these questions answered. So yeah, for me, like thematically, like this is a story that really is exploring kind of this orthodoxy, and I think kind of putting a lens up to ourselves, like how orthodox are we, like to the point where I think it's interesting in the end, like the rather than having more of a conversation with Herbertson and Latter-day Saints on Earth, it's just like we're just gonna start over, right? So in a way, it almost ends. It's kind of like an origin story of like a new restoration that's gonna happen. Like it's not there's not a compromise. There's not a conversation and a give and take. Like it's just right, starting over.
That's better than I was trying to say. So here's my question for you then. Did you set out to write that story? George Saunders talks about when you put pen to paper, it should be a joyful, curious experience. Of course, easy for him to say, but when you set out to write the story, what did you originally think it was going to be about?
Yeah, this one particular story is, as far as what I wanted to write, it was this. I've always had this sense that a really interesting place in Mormonism is the place where you kind of hold the religion itself to its own standards and say, hey, like there's any number of, like the concept of a divine truth that is sort of like universally accepted, that crosses cultures, crosses times, crosses and is correct in every particular and right in everything that it says. Like, that concept is a very tense concept. It creates a lot of tensions, and there's a lot of things that people who are kind of in the tradition have to do to relieve those tensions and to kind of, and I know very well sort of what people can tend to do to not have to contend with the problem, to contend with something where you say, hey, this thing was true, this thing is no longer true, and what does that mean, and how does that work? And so it's always been sort of a fun thought experiment for me to think, well, what would happen if someone really had to deal with it, rather than say, hey, like we've got these sort of outs of like, well, like it was a different time, or every recognizable religion has these sorts of adaptations or things like that. But if someone really sat down and said, no, you have to account for the changes, you have to account for the adaptation, you have to account that the culture is different now than it was before. And so the story itself wasn't, I don't know that I had like a place where I wanted to land with it, but at least at the beginning, I've always wanted to write that story where somebody has to deal with it. And I think I was rather lucky to start with the prophet, the fictional prophet, I should say. But it was nice that was the character that just kind of came, because it allowed for I think a much richer kind of conversation there, but than it would have been just kind of a lay member, I think. But yeah, it started there as kind of just wanting to be like, well, what would happen? Can I write something satisfying where, this does happen and people do kind of, they revert to the ways that they're trying to get out of it and it doesn't work, and then what do they do next? And that was always the hope that it would come off successfully.
It very much does. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
I wanted to, because it's such an interesting story, and in a way, it's kind of the aliens and Herbertson, like these encounters, but I was so drawn to the president, and right, and she's so interesting, the kind of probably president that I would want to have, and but also, right, a little kind of judgmental of the LDS community in Utah. But could you talk maybe just a little bit about where the inspiration for the president came up, and what role you see her taking? I've heard, I kind of teach students, that characters are kind of little motors, that kind of move the narrative forward. What role do you see her playing in this story?
Yeah, I mean, I love the president as a character. I think she's one of my most favorite characters I've ever written. Like, there's something about her that I just find kind of charming to read about and to kind of follow along. The thing that she provides is that I needed somebody who was outside of the culture. I needed somebody who was enough outside, at least, that they could have some more honest reactions to things. And there's those passages where she's interacting with Utah, and she thinks of it kind of as that, like, Utah, monolithic Utah is weird, and it's off-putting, and she's trying really hard, but at the same time there's this kind of fantastic quality about the people that she encounters, the conversations that she has, and honestly, my kind of the hope that one of the things that she brought out, Joe, you were talking earlier about how when you're writing speculative fiction, there's this need to sort of like sum up a large culture quickly, and all the different apparatus of that. I think oftentimes, especially when you're writing about in kind of Mormon circles, there's a real need to do that for the Mormon culture as well. Like I can remember talking to a therapist at one point and trying to explain kind of the entirety of the culture and in its impacts and the way that it kind of works out between people and things like that. And there's just a lot there. And I needed somebody who was I almost said alien to that. I think someone outside of that.
Absolutely.
In order to basically to kind of point out, I guess, that the culture that Herbertson is contending with in terms of the aliens has that mismatch, that mistranslation has some of the same resonances, like from inside the Mormon circle outward as well. And the president managed to do that. She does for me when I read it. So
it's such a beautiful layering, of like, you've got the actual aliens coming from who knows where, and then you've got like people who come to Utah from other parts of the country that kind of feel like aliens, right? Or like they themselves are aliens, or they've stumbled upon this alien culture. I love this. He said she woke one morning with the familiar crushing Utah feeling hovering around her thoughts, like she's trapped in this place and she just wants to go back and like just forget about all this, like this is insanity. But of course, this monumental world-changing event, she has to be there of all places in Utah, which, I mean, I love Utah. We all, obviously, many of us have lived there and love it. But there's a reason why, like, the culture at large in the last few years has quote unquote discovered Utah culture and are so fascinated by it, right? Because it really does represent something that is worth exploring from the inside out, that kind of makes you step back and go, oh, wow. And yeah, the president she's the perfect foil for that. And she's the perfect reality check, right? At the end of the story, when, they're having, Herbertson and the aliens are having these arcane discussions, or trying to have these arcane doctrinal discussions, and like hashing out these things that to them feel very, very important. And the president, that I love the scene where she ends up getting to sit in front of the aliens and basically says, who, the Mormons? Oh yeah, we don't really think about them at all. Oh, and they're just, and the aliens are just, their heads explode, they can't even believe it. I think getting back to this idea that we were talking about this a little bit right before you logged on, about, what we love about the story and how it gets me thinking about this mission that we've always kind of proclaimed in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to bring the gospel to all the world, which, like, without necessarily coming out and saying it, we kind of means like turning everybody into us, like making everybody believe the way we do, and, act the way we do, and value the same things that we value. And we kind of just like are easily able to kind of talk about that as an unexamined good. Like that would be the best case scenario. If tomorrow everybody woke up and said, I'm going to get baptized today, and that happened. And then these aliens come and kind of put it in front of your face and say, yeah, this is what it looks like when that happens. And we, quote unquote, I am identifying with the saints in the story, with Herbertson, and the saints suddenly have to go like, oh yeah, well, I mean, we talk about that, but I mean, that's kind of crazy though, right? Like, to think that everybody would take this seriously, and that Brother Joseph's words would become like the guiding principles of an entire civilization. And it's, I don't think it's certainly not, I don't think making any, casting shade on the church specifically, but in the way, like you said, the way that we are able to kind of slide by without really thinking about the things that we say and believe, and what the ultimate ramifications of those things would be. Do we really want a world where every single person is specifically a part of this belief system, this value system, and this culture, right? Because you can't really necessarily completely separate the two. So anyways, that to me was just such a delightful reversal.
Well, and if I could say, I think that's why the president's character is so compelling to me. Yeah, because I mean, you say it so well, Joe, and you're right, Danny, you're exploring it here. Yeah, like I think sometimes in the church, right, there's this kind of elitism, and we see that in what's his name, the Hollyoak? Am I?
I said Holyoke, but it's just written.
Holyoke.
He's made up. You can call him what you like.
Okay, Holyoke, and even Herbertson at times, like where he's had this conversation with the Pope, and he's like this theological conversation, and he's like, I think I won that conversation. That I think, right? I think sometimes, in the gospel and the church and proselytizing, it's kind of this one-way street where it's like, here's the culture we want to give you, but there's no like asking like let us receive from you, like what about your culture can we learn from? And I think the president like is such a beautiful character because it feels like there's a true cultural exchange going on. At first she's annoyed with Utah, but then right after time, like she comes to like it. And there's that beautiful moment. I kept thinking, why is the president, what's all the, the big deal with the superstructure, where she gets the map of the Wasatch Front and, she recognizes, like, oh, there's some good city planning here, but like, I can make it even better. And so I feel like there's this recognition in the end with the president. She can see the good of the culture and she could also give to the culture, and it's this like truly back and forth. And I think there's a larger theme there that you're exploring about how we have a healthy society, and maybe in the church we need to be a little bit about more cultural exchanges rather than just giving culture.
Yeah, I mean that the challenge of culture is hopefully something that's all the way through, right? Where you've got aliens culture, you've got Mormon culture, you've got the culture that the president largely understands, and the hope is, the hope is that everyone is sort of talking about being right and being sort of have access to the truth, I guess, and the trouble, I guess, I think you're right in identifying that there is this sort of undercurrent that like. What Herbertson has to say, right, is that for our culture to survive, for our culture to live, we have to conform to wherever we're at. Like we have to stay there. And the aliens have this really strong negative reaction to that. That feels like betrayal, because their culture is all about kind of like absolute rigid truth. And as far as how that can be, I don't know. When I read this, sometimes I think for me, it's so much about kind of exploring that space and kind of being in that space, but it is also really interesting because the church obviously has adapted over the years. The church is different now than it was when I was a kid, than it was 10 years ago. Like there's just constant thing. And but in a large part, I'm a beneficiary of those adaptations. Like and I'm largely in favor of them. I think it was somebody who wrote about the Book of Mormon musical that said like the images of a church that like maybe is slow about it, but kind of gets to a point where it can live peaceably with the rest of everybody and do whatever little good in its sphere that it can do. And so, the purpose is not to point, as I think some people in the church often do, right? To point at something and say, hey, there's an inconsistency here, and that's wrong, as much as to say that like there is also written into the culture a set of responses that come when you try to say two things that you think are true but are actually contradictory, and the ways that you kind of navigate that and try to survive that contradictory nature I just think is really interesting, and I think really specifically interesting in the church, because the church, I think, takes a kind of unique approach to the truth and finding the truth. Like I think religions in general, the people who follow them tend to say, hey, this resonates with me as a human being. There's this kind of like like I follow the precepts, I follow the rituals and so forth, and I receive human good out of that. But the church tends to, there's this quasi-scientific portion of it where it's like everything is true, and you can find that out, you can learn that for yourself, and that's I think one of the things that's really appealing about the church, but also sets you up for problems when it isn't this kind of the large avenue of truth, when you start looking at things that you might see on the edges. And the trouble is that avenue shifts around as the culture shifts around, and so something that might have been right dead center in the avenue, like polygamy, that is a good example, will shift to the margins at some point, and then what do you do with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, because like I think there is this movement, I hope in the church, right, to be more progressive and adaptable. But sometimes within that, right, there's maybe like a denial of our past, like a shame of our past. I love and it's a stroke of genius, and I'd love to know, a little bit more about this, but the introduction of the Urim and Thummim. And it's just this great moment, right, where they're looking around, for these spectacles, and, the 12 apostles are putting them on. But it's just interesting, like that Herbertson, right? There's a kind of shame, I feel, or an embarrassment associated with kind of Mormonism's magical and folkloric past. And, I think a healthy organization, and maybe this is one of Herbertson's flaws, like, he to see something in its wholeness, right? You have to see, past, present, and future. And he's certainly moving into the future, but like there's that kind of denial, that inability to want to see the past. So you want to say anything about the Urim and Thummim?
Do I ever?
Yeah. Do you have one there? Maybe on your bookshelf there.
No. It's, the Journal of Mormon is a good thing, and I hope I wasn't disrespectful about it. But it's a really excellent way of kind of pointing at something that is real and is true. Like this is a true thing that is part of the story. This is a true, like as far as the story of Mormonism is concerned, this happened. Like this is an absolute physical fact. As far as your mileage may vary on the claims, but as far as like that a thing existed that Joseph Smith used, appears to be borne out, and at very least in the story we tell, it's there. And yet, I think you would be hard pressed to find a congregation that, if you got up in the testimony meeting and said you wanted to bear your testimony on the reality of the Urim and Thummim, I think you would be hard pressed to find a congregation that wouldn't be uncomfortable with it, that wouldn't be like, wow, that's a weird thing. That's an odd thing to have to like speak about being truly. But certainly at some point, that was a part of someone's testimony. It had to be, because you had a person named Joseph Smith who was saying, hey, I have this apparatus by which I am translating in a fairly supernatural way this text, and someone had to say that is something that I'm going to believe based on kind of the religious experience of the evidence that I have, and that can be part of my testimony. Like that can be part of a true thing. And if you look over the years of the sorts of things that have kind of bubbled up in people's testimonies, the things that have been core, there have been lots of really weird things, or at least things that we probably today would feel were weird. I was watching, and I'm probably going to get this wrong because it was years and years ago, but I was watching one of the first televised general conferences, and it was I believe it was George Albert Smith. Again, I'm probably very wrong, but he was finishing up the conference session, and he was talking about age assistance, which became Social Security in our country. And he was not a fan. Like, he was in fact quite angry about the concept, and was, and at the, like, this is the last speech of a general conference. This is it wouldn't be unreasonable for someone to go away from that thinking that's divine. That's something that is coming straight from God. And I don't think that, like, getting up and bearing a testimony about how terrible Social Security is would be something that, again, we'd feel very comfortable with. And so the sort of mass of things that are quote unquote true, but also we don't really want to engage with them as if they are true, is really quite extensive, since the church has been around for so long. And the Urim and Thummim is kind of a heightened example, which hopefully again kind of rings out. And it was also really nice because so much about this work is about translation and the uncertainty of translation, of not being able to know exactly what things are being said. You think about someone like Joseph Smith entering into a translation practice, and how fraught that is. If you've ever done translation work, it's terrifying to try to accurately convey something. And so the Urim and Thummim it did those two things, which was really nice, which is to say, hey, yeah, here's this true thing from the true past that truly is something to engage with. And also it helps us supposedly with how we can communicate with each other, except for maybe it kind of didn't.
That's also another brilliant layer of, there's so much to say about this idea of translation that makes the story delightfully funny and absurd. And, this idea that everything that we have, all the stories we tell, all the things we think we know about God kind of come to us through these layers across time and space. And in this story, you really push the space part, right? Like, things come down over time. But what about when things get transmitted across unimaginable distances? How do they get modified, twisted? Anyways, it's just, and the Urim and Thummim is, to me, anytime you bring extraterrestrials into a story, one of the main things you're going to need to address is technology. And so it was just a beautiful way of kind of bridging the gap between how the aliens, there's clearly a technologically superior people, but it's almost adorable. Like, this story does what such great stories do, which is you feel kind of a genuine empathy and kind of tenderness towards all the characters. You see all of them in kind of their foolishness, and yet you also feel this genuine empathy, and to kind of feel that for the aliens, right? They've come all this way. They have the superior technology. They have this, the superior culture in some ways, but they need something from us. They want something from us so badly. And, the great tragedy of the story, like the great pathos of the story, I think, is that of course, they don't get it. And they walk away disappointed and empty-handed, which I think to me doesn't feel like a condemnation, but feels like a call, right? Like, what would we have to offer people who are, who have in some ways such superior technology and abilities? What would we have to offer them that they don't already have? It's not polygamy, right? So anyways, but I know that brings us kind of towards the end of the story, when the disappointment happens and they go away empty-handed. And I love too that they are just so utterly uninterested in anything else. Like, they look at Earth and they think there's nothing else here that we want. They don't look back and go, we should take these minerals while we're here. Like, they just quietly leave. But brings us to the last scene, which the first time I read it, of course it was like, oh, first vision, like another first vision. But like, upon closer examination, there's something kind of beautiful and also frightening about, to me, after I read the story a few times, frightening about that last scene. How do you see it, Danny? Do you see it as like a hopeful renewal, or do you see it as a kind of like retrenchment, or is it all those things.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that for me, it's complex. Like you talk about like the aliens go away disappointed, and I think one of the things that is really interesting about kind of the way that this story kind of fell together was that, what the aliens want is like contemporary revelation. That's what they want. That's what they've traveled for, and that is what Herbertson is should be able to provide them. Like in the context, like that's what he should be able to provide them. And just in the same way that there is, like the manifesto or whatever, where like where you say, hey, continuing revelation says, for example, polygamy has ended now. Obviously that was a hard thing at the moment. Like it wasn't just like someone flipped a switch and everyone was like, oh, okay, this thing that we've cared about for a really long time is no longer a thing. But they did it because they believed in that kind of contemporary revelation. And the aliens are presented with that as well. And, like really what Herbertson is saying is, this is what God has revealed. This is what God did reveal for us. And the aliens can't accept it. And so, and so I think there's a little bit of a criticism perhaps of the alien approach as well, to say, that they can't, because it doesn't conform with what they expect, they can't accept it either. And so when we get to the end, the thing that kind of, for me at least, that I think is sort of the strongest theme in it is, there's a certain amount of inevitability that comes when you have these sorts of tensions in any kind of human organization, but especially in one that like really purports to say, we're going to give you the whole vision of everything, where you exist in the world, why you matter, what's going on. Like, just as you keep going on, there's all these tensions and all of these inconsistencies and things that happen. And it's very natural to do as Joseph Smith did, say, clearly this confusion, clearly this straining to align things that cannot be aligned, clearly that can't continue. There has to be some sort of simplification. There has to be something that kind of brings us back to something that is a little more pure, a little more clear. And I personally doubt that the aliens have that answer. I imagine that the aliens won't really understand human behavior very well, because I don't, like you say, I think there's certainly something alarming in the idea of saying, hey, this person that existed in the past, who we really can't reach anymore, laid down the entirety of what is true, and that's where it ends. But we also know there are religions like that out there. There are certainly ones that exist and either survive or adapt as time goes on. And so I think that for me at least, there's this sense that like there's elements of good, there's elements of bad in it, but I think mostly it's just sort of like this is a thing that just kind of keeps recurring. And that the question is whether the fact that somebody can say, hey, you've fallen from the truth, hey, you've got this really kind of like glaring inconsistency in your own theology, does that put into question that the truth claim? Does it make the truth claim less viable or not? Or is it just another one of those things where you say, well, that's just how human organizations go, and we're going to kind of sidestep that discomfort?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and it's interesting to think about, like the story ends where it ends, but, as I tell my students, right, stories always continue, right, even though they're not being written. And I mean, I can't help thinking that the aliens, like, they're so orthodox, they're so rigid. It's interesting when Herbertson has that vision of their world, like he still sees like, oh, there are poets among them, there's beautiful things, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of agency, or there doesn't seem to be a lot of the ability to like think beyond one's ideology to just other scenarios, any other thoughts. So I can't help thinking whatever restoration they're gonna create won't last long, because I think one of the lessons of your story here is, I think for me, the aliens represent, like, we know so many people like this, like these very rigid Orthodox members of the church, who just can't imagine that there's a spectrum of belief in their congregation. You know, they kind of define the terms the way that they want. They see the doctrine the way that they want. So yeah, I guess, Danny, I see here there's a lesson here in, if you want to have a strong institution, right there, there has to be flexibility. There has to be some adaptation.
Although, you know, if we're talking about strong institutions, it seems like the aliens, they've got the impenetrable, you know, unchanging, all-encompassing, all-powerful church. And that's, you know, is that what God wants? Right? I think that's the really interesting question there. So
Well,
yeah, no, go. And
I was just going to say, and I think, you know, it's this sort of security in truth, where truth is this thing that is so real that it isn't an interpretive dance at all. It's you know, like, for them at least, and they could be wildly wrong, they probably are, but for them at least, it's this thing that you can't escape. It's, you know, it's a slap in the face, or stepping off a cliff and you fall. Like, it's always, it's that inevitability. And I remember being a missionary and speaking like this about the truths that we were teaching, where it was like, hey, people are just going to recognize it. It's going to slap them across the face. They're going to be so bowled over because they're just going to see it, because of course they're just going to see it. And that was very rarely the experience. And you have a lot of ways of managing that. You know, I go, well, they're all influenced by the devil, or, you know, whatever you do to kind of navigate that. But yeah, it's, you know, like the creation of this, I don't know what you mean, this space where that actually works, turns out to be a lot more challenging, I think. And I also think it's kind of, for me at least, now that I've, you know, had a little distance from reading it again, one of the things that I thought in one of my last readings was, if and it's kind of intimated, but if Herbertson had been Brigham Young, well, I don't know, I don't want to start talking about contemporary people, but if he'd been Brigham Young, he would have just been like, it's these three, you two over there, you're the polygamous ones, like, it wouldn't have been, and the aliens probably would have just left and been like, great, we got what we wanted, and we're ready to go. And the fact that, you know, the church has morphed into something that is careful and is cognizant of the playing field, I think is largely a good thing. I'm personally very much in favor of it, but it's also the tragedy of Herbertson here, because that's the game he's trying to play, and it's the wrong game.
Exactly. Yeah. Danny, I think we need to start wrapping this up, because we're about there. But again, thank you so much for bringing this story to us. This is, many people have talked about how, you know, Mormonism is a natural fit with sci-fi and with this idea of a larger universe, and we kind of make these vague gestures when we read, like in The Pearl of Great Price, like, oh yeah, there's other worlds out there, God created all of them. And you really bring this to a kind of embodied moment here, where it's like, that's such a wild idea, right? Like, as soon as they come and say, well, we've got three genders, like, my first response was, of course, in the infinite vastness of the universe, everything exists, right? And we'd like to think that it's all could be easily contained within this system that we have here. But thank you for kind of reminding us about how big and strange and funny and wonderful it all is, and sparking my imagination. What are you, before we go, what are you working on right now? Are you going to be the guy that keeps writing LDS infused stories about extraterrestrials? Are you going to be the Steven Spielberg of Mormon literature, or what are you doing right now, and what are you doing next?
You know, it would be wonderful, and it's been great to be able to participate in so many of these opportunities for publishing stories, and to kind of speak to a culture that, for a large part of my life I took as just sort of like the default culture, really just thinking this is just how everybody is, and then throughout life learning that it is not like that largely for the rest of the world, but then being able to come back and speak to a group that both understands what you mean when you say the stuff, when you start talking about aspects of the culture, but also has a sophistication to kind of look at it as well and say, yeah, there's something kind of even literary about the oddness and the I will say the peculiarity.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it would be lovely to keep kind of in that vein. Currently, myself, as far as writing, I'm working on a number of novel projects that aren't specifically Mormon, but that kind of touch on a lot of the different things that are in this piece. Translation is a big part of them, as well as where we fit in terms of like ourselves, as well as like God and the supernatural, how that can both inform us about who we are and also lie about who we are, and create problems that way. So yeah, it's that's really what I'm working on right now. But if there's another project like this, let me know, because I love writing these stories.
Well, we will keep apprised of what else happens, and when you get something else that you feel works for the dialogue audience, please don't hesitate to send it our way.
I will take that compliment. Thank you.
Ryan, what do you have to say before we wrap up?
Just, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. You have, Danny, you have two fans here, two rabid fans, and I know there's going to be a lot more out there when we give even wider audience to the story. So yeah, please think of us at Dialogue the next time you have a story that's ready to go.
Yeah, I definitely will. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. We will see you around the bend. Those of you that listen, thank you for being with us in the Dialogue Out Loud podcast. This story, Narrow is the Gate by Danny Nelson, can be found in the summer issue of Dialogue. There will also be an audio recording, a professionally produced and acted audio recording of the story, which I think will be utterly delightful. Can't wait to see it, hear it. Thank you again for being here. We'll talk to you soon.
Greetings, my name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.